We might not be able to get out as much as we like, but our imaginations still can. So in that spirit, I'd like to tell you a wee story about one of my favourite places in Cumbernauld, Ravenswood Local Nature Reserve. Nowadays, Ravenswood and its marsh is a haven for wildlife, but this is an ancient site, and it hasn't always been that way. So you might not know this, but long ago, the boggy marsh of Ravenswood was much, much larger than it is today. Not many people lived there, but it was home to all sorts of supernatural creatures. There was bogles, there was boggarts, there were brownies, will-o'-the-wisps, walking trees, black dogs, and even witches, who rode across the marsh on great black water snakes. These creatures made the marsh a very dangerous place to go after dark, but there was one wetland spirit that people could trust, and who would look after any travellers who came across him. He was known as the Mossy Man, and he lived in the deep dark pools in the centre of Ravenswood, coming out only at night or when the mist rose. He was only 3 feet tall and covered head to toe with sphagnum moss. He had a great long white beard and walked with a birch branch as a cane. He always wore an old tam o' shanter on his head with a long cockade, and he wore a dark cloak woven out of marsh grass that allowed him to disappear into the shadows if he wanted to hide from curious eyes. People saw him sometimes, a small shape with a dark back, a white chest and a tall cockade, walking round the marsh, but as soon as they tried to focus on him, he would fade into the background and become just the faintest hint of movement in the shadows. And then, the only way that people could follow him would be to listen for his laugh, which sounded just like the call of a lapwing. The Mossy Man was a cheerful spirit, and he did his best to help the people who lived nearby. If an animal or a child went missing in the moss, or the waters overflowed and flooded the fields, the local people would call out for him, and they would shout, Mossy Man, moan out and hear us. Will I abide your rule and law if you this favour gie us? They would pour a bowl of water into the moss, and the next morning the lost animal or child would be returned safe, or the flood waters would recede back into the marsh. This continued for many years until one day the local lords decided that the marsh should be drained to become farmland. They brought in workers from all over the country, and the local people were promised great benefits and riches from the new work. But the Ravenswood folk knew that no good would come of it, because if the water pools were drained, then what would happen to the Mossy Man? Still, it went ahead, and the new workers laboured on the land every day, digging ditches and clearing away the moss, allowing the marsh water to flow down and away to the sea. Gradually, the moss got drier and drier, and the wild bog disappeared. As the marsh dried out, however, more and more reports came of strange goings-on in the surrounding areas. Bogles started coming into people's homes, stealing clothes and smashing crockery. Boggarts scared the horses in the fields, causing them to sicken and die. And brownies, as they will, stole the milk from cows. Will-o'-the-wisps lured workers out into the marsh where they were lost and never seen again. But money talks, and the people kept working. The marsh drained steadily, and as it dwindled, so did the people's beliefs and their memories. One by one, the people forgot about the Mossy Man, and as they forgot, so too did the bogles and the boggarts and the will-o'-the-wisps fade into obscurity. The people became sickly, their homes flooded, the crops withered in the fields, and animals died. They lived in poverty and misery, but they no longer remembered why. And still, no matter what happened, the local lords paid no heed. They just brought in, every time a worker disappeared, they just brought in replacements. And they told people that things would be better when the marsh was finally drained. All their problems would be solved. But things just gradually grew steadily worse. And finally, one morning, the local people awoke to discover that the marsh and their homes were surrounded by a thick mist. As they got up and began to go about their business, they soon discovered, to their horror, that all the children in the local area had disappeared. Now some people remembered the old stories, but instead of blaming the bogles and the boggarts, they blamed the witches that were supposed to live on the moss, and they marched out with flaming torches to confront them. Many poor old men and women who had committed no crime but to be old, or to be lonely, or to live apart from other people, were put to death by the mob, accused of riding water snakes around the marsh and of snatching away babies. It made no difference. The next day the mist was as thick as before, and the children were still lost. There was one old woman left on the outskirts of the village who had not been accused of witchcraft, and the local people determined that she must be to blame, so they resolved to capture her and burn her at the stake. They marched out with their flaming torches, and as they approached the old woman's home, she saw them coming, and she ran out on the moss to escape. The people saw her go and gave chase, and soon they were all as lost as each other, out on the drained wildland that now stood where the marsh had once been. The old woman kept running, and the people kept chasing her. And eventually, she had run so far that she reached the centre of the old marsh. Here she found there was still some pools of water left, and as she splashed through them, she heard the call of a lapwing, and it made her stop dead in her tracks. The people were just about to seize her when they too heard the lapwing's call and felt the splash of marsh water at their feet. It was as if a dam had burst, as one by one they all remembered the bogles and the boggarts, the brownies, the will-o'-wisps and the walking trees. As they remembered, the shadows about them hardened and sinister laughter could be heard. Ghostly hands reached out through the mists and grabbed at them. Bogles ran between their legs and tripped them. Brownies threw stones and knocked them to the ground. The air grew stale and the light faded as walking trees surrounded them, shutting off the sky. But the old woman, who the people were going to burn as a witch, remembered the Mossy Man, just in time, and she called out the old rhyme. Mossy Man, moan out and hear us. Will I abide your rule and law, if you this favour gie us? And as she called, a tear fell from her eye and landed in the moss. As soon as it touched the earth, the people all heard a sound like a lapwing calling, and the sound of this brought the memory of the Mossy Man back to them as well. And soon they were all chanting, Mossy Man, moan out and hear us. Will I abide your rule and law, if you this favour gie us? And they all poured whatever water they had on them out onto the marsh. As they poured the water into the marsh, pools bubbled up and the water around them grew deeper and deeper. The bogles and brownies and sinister creatures all began to fade away again, and the mist started to lift. The people looked round, and everyone saw a shadow of what looked like a tiny man with a dark cloak over his back and a long white beard over his chest and a tall cockade stuck into his tam o' shanter, walking away through the marsh. They followed the shadow, which always stayed just ahead of them, right on the edge of vision. And eventually, the shadow led them back into the village where they'd come from. And as they arrived, the people were amazed and delighted to see that their children were back before them, peeping out of windows and doorways, looking for their lost parents. Everyone knew what had happened. The Mossy Man had not forgotten them, even though they had forgotten him. From that day on, they refused to allow the Lord to drain any more of the marsh, and they built dams across the remaining peat to slow the flow of water running away to the sea. And every year, on the anniversary of the children's return, they would all walk down to the bund at the end of the marsh, each with as much water as they could carry, and they would pour it out into the marsh while saying, Mossy Man, glad we are you heard us. Will I abide your rule and law, and keep the moss around us? And as they did so, the Mossy Man would come and stand at the edge of the shadows, and they would see his dark cloak, his white beard, and the green cockade on his tam o' shanter, and they would hear his laughter, like the call of lapwings. The people kept this up for a long, long time. But as tends to happen, memories fade, and eventually the people stopped going to the bund and pouring water, and they forgot the words to the old rhymes. The Mossy Man isn't seen anymore, but if you go out onto the moss on a misty day, you might see a shape with a dark back, a white chest, and a tall green cockade atop its head, and you'll hear the call of the lapwing, telling us that the Mossy Man remembers. Ravenswood is one of the many sites that Cumbernauld Living Landscape are working on around the town. It's home to all sorts of wildlife, including otters, water rail and snipe, and it's a fantastic place to see wildflowers and insects, particularly dragonflies and bumblebees. It's also a great place to just go for a walk, enjoying the peace of the marsh and the stretches of woodland. Work on the reserve has included building the outdoor classroom and giant bug hotel at the entrance, working with local schools to design and install the banter bench, and planting thousands of wet meadow wildflowers to help boost the site's attractiveness to pollinators and people alike. Every year volunteers go out onto the marsh itself to remove some of the young trees, which would dry the marsh out if they were left. Sounds like a lot, but there's still a lot to do. Our future plans include sprucing up the entrance area, maintaining the living willow fence that the Wildways Well group built there, improving the paths and planting thousands more wildflowers. So don't worry, there'll be lots of opportunities for you to get involved once our volunteering programme restarts. As always, thanks for listening to our tale of Ravenswood and the Mossy Man. If you've been inspired to write your own nature tale or have your own stories of Ravenswood, then why not let us know? Look out for more films, pictures, stories and activities from the Cumbernauld Living Landscape team over the coming weeks.